Aside from it being the first Valentine's Day that I spent with the woman who ended up becoming my wife, Valentine's Day 2013 was the worst date of my life. It had nothing to do with Katrina. She was amazing as always. It was actually because of what happened after the date. You see, we had been dating for 6 months by that point, and I wanted to do something special for her. She always talked about how much she loved musicals, but had never been to Broadway, so I got us both tickets to the Phantom of the Opera. We decided to take the train down to the city and spent the day walking around and grabbing some food before finally seeing the play. The show itself was really well done, and when it was over, we couldn't stop talking about it. The only bad thing was that it ended, which signified the end of our night. We knew that at that point we needed to get back to the train station as fast as we could to catch the next one back upstate. And by that point, it was already dark out, though you wouldn't really know it with how illuminated the sidewalks were in the city. At first, I was a little nervous to be walking through the city at night, but I couldn't let that show in front of Katrina. Thankfully, it proved not to be that scary, and I was able to calm down for the most part, at least until we got into the subway. You see, we had to take the subway and then transfer over to our train station down the line. Sadly, the subway station was where our night took a turn. As we made our way down the stairs and we could hear the sound of a train pulling away, signifying that we had just missed one. That was a little annoying, but at first, I figured it meant more time to talk to Katrina, so I really didn't mind. However, when I noticed that there was a group of 3 men staring at us from further down on the platform, I began to get uneasy. They noticed that I was looking back in their direction, and to my surprise, they all started walking toward us. I grabbed Katrina's hand and told her that we should walk to a different station, and she could tell by the look on my face that I was serious, so she didn't ask me why. We both stood up and began walking away from the men who were walking toward us when they called out. "Hey," they yelled, "can we ask you something?" We tried to ignore them as we made our way toward the stairs, but it was then that I could hear the sound of them beginning to run toward us. I squeezed Katrina's hand tight and told her to run and get help before I let go and turned to face the men who were running toward us. Katrina continued making her way toward the stairs, and thankfully all 3 of the men stopped when they got to me. I asked them if there was anything that I could do for them as I tried to pull their attention away from my date. She was out of my sight by the time they began asking about the bag that Katrina was wearing. I didn't know anything about fancy clothes, but apparently it was a nice one. And before they even asked me if I had money, I knew that I was being robbed. I tried to level with the men and explain to them that she went to get help and that they should just leave me alone, but that just made them more aggressive. They stopped asking me questions, and the biggest one in the group decided to grab me by the shoulders and throw me onto the ground before they went through my pockets. They took everything that I had, including my cell phone, and before running off in the opposite direction, they gave me a few kicks to the chest, claiming that I shouldn't have gotten the cops involved. By the time Katrina returned with the officer, the men were long gone. Thankfully, I was able to use her phone to call the bank and cancel all my cards before they could spend anything. At the end of the day, I was just glad that Katrina was all right. The officer waited with us until the next train came and saw that we were heading in the right direction before he sent us off. I usually don't ever use dating apps, but my friends encouraged me to check out Tinder after my boyfriend had broken up with me. And after a little while, I ended up finding this guy that seemed really interesting. We had a lot of things in common, and according to him, he was like me in that he wasn't looking for a relationship right away. Now, as the days began to lead up to Valentine's Day, Andy had asked me if I wanted to hang out. I told him that I wasn't looking for a date yet, especially not on Valentine's Day, but he assured me that we were just going to hang out the mall as friends. While I was reluctant at first, I ended up deciding to go with him because I figured that I could always leave if things got too weird. And to my surprise, it was actually a lot of fun hanging out with him. The 2 of us walked around the mall for a while and grabbed some food at the food court before realizing how fast time was going by. It had already been 4 hours, and by that point it was pretty dark out. We realized the mall would probably be closing soon, so I decided to call it a night. I began to say goodbye to Andy when he asked me where I had parked my car. and after I described where I parked to him, he suggested giving me a ride to my car. He apparently parked right next to the exit and claimed that he felt better about him dropping me off in my car rather than me walking through the dark parking lot alone. I appreciated the thought, and since we had such a good time together, I decided to take him up on the offer. As we both made our way out to his car, I even joked that it turned into a pretty good Valentine's date. Boy, was I wrong. We got into Andy's car and began making our way through the parking lot. However, I quickly noticed that we were not driving toward my car, and instead he was heading toward the exit of the parking lot and onto the highway. I asked him what he was doing, but when I looked over at him, all I could see was a big smile on his face. And as I looked down, I noticed that he had a gun sitting in his lap. I asked him where he was taking me, but he didn't answer. I tried to stay strong, but I couldn't help but begin to cry a bit. It didn't have any effect on him, though. Andy just continued to drive until eventually we were pulled into a truck stop. As he parked his car, he turned to look at me, and as he shoved his gun into my face, he explained that some people were about to come and pick me up. I began crying again as he continued to tell me that I would never see my home or my family again. And as I looked up at him, he very calmly warned me that if I tried anything, he would not hesitate to pull the trigger. My heart began to pound as I saw a set of headlights pulling up to the parking lot next to ours. Andy began to smile again. "I think that's them," he said as he looked over at the car that was parked beside us. Andy warned me not to do anything foolish before he stepped out of the car to greet them. I could hear them talking about money, and Andy described me as clean multiple times, though I didn't know what that means. And before I knew it, I was being dragged out of the passenger seat of the car by a man who wasn't Andy. Without saying a word, the man who had pretended to befriend me on Tinder was getting back into his car and getting ready to drive away. However, just as Andy began to pull away, I heard the beautiful sound of police sirens as a fleet of cars came rolling into the truck stop. Within minutes, all three of the men, including Andy, were in handcuffs, and I was in the back of an ambulance being checked for signs of shock. According to the officers, they had been watching the two men for a few weeks due to suspicion of their involvement with a human trafficking ring. According to them, I was almost their next victim. It was our fourth date, which happened to land on Valentine's Day. Emily and I had been seeing each other for about 3 weeks, and we were both keen on taking it slow, considering we had both just gotten out of some lengthy relationships. So that night, our plan was to just see a movie in the early afternoon and then grab something to eat afterward before I was supposed to drop her off at her house. However, things didn't go entirely as planned. We had just finished the movie and made our way over to an Italian restaurant that we had made reservations for earlier in the week. When we got there, both of us were amazed at how nicely they decorated the place. Any other day of the week, it just looked like your typical restaurant. But for Valentine's Day, they set out nice tablecloths and flowers for every table. It also seemed like the whole restaurant was lit up using candles. The ambiance was really romantic, though that was quickly ruined as soon as we realized we weren't alone. It was about 5 minutes into our meal, and we were chowing down on some bread when I noticed that someone was staring at us from a few tables over. I gave it a minute to make sure that I wasn't misreading the situation, but after some time passed and the man continued to stare, I decided to ask the server what was going on. I signaled for him to come over and quietly asked him if he knew why the man was staring over at our table. That's when Emily looked over at him, which caused her to gasp, and oddly enough made him finally avert his eyes away from our table. I asked Emily what was going on, and that's when she pointed out that he was the guy that she was dating before me. And right away, she thought that he was following her. I tried to calm her down and told her that although it was awkward, I was sure that he was waiting on a date of his own. However, I couldn't have been more wrong. The entire dinner, neither of us could really eat any of our food because of how uncomfortable he was making us with his direct staring. The only times he looked away was when Emily would look over at him. Finally, we had had enough and decided to call it quits. It was a wonderful date aside from him showing up, so we both figured we would call it a night. We got our food put into boxes and began heading out of the restaurant. We were about halfway across the parking lot when I noticed Emily gripping my arm tighter. I looked down at her and she whispered that her ex had left with us. I quickly ushered her to my car and helped her inside before running around and hopping in the driver's seat. The entire car ride to her house, we talked about how crazy it was that he would just show up like that, but I tried to assure Emily that everything was going to be okay. As we pulled into her driveway, I went to say goodnight and tell her that I had a great time spending Valentine's Day with her when she surprised me. She asked if I wanted to come inside, though not for the reason you might think. As I said, we were taking things slow. Instead, we both figured it would be safer if I slept on the couch in case her ex decided to show up for some reason. It was a good thing I did, too. It was about 1:30 in the morning when I woke up to use the bathroom, but when I returned to the couch in the living room, I was frozen in place by what I saw. You see, the couch was located directly underneath the window that faced Emily's front lawn, and as soon as my eyes looked toward the window, I could see that someone was standing on the other side of it. My eyes widened as I realized that it was the man who was at the restaurant. I quickly ran over to the front door to make sure it was locked, which I'm glad I did because I could hear him trying to turn the handle. I grabbed my phone off the coffee table and began to call the police as I walked into Emily's room. She was startled when I woke her up, but I very calmly explained to her what was going on as I also requested police assistance. The two of us waited in her room until we saw the flashing red and blue lights. Sadly, by the time they got there, her ex was nowhere to be found. Later that week, Emily ended up filing a restraining order against him, and aside from a few court dates, she hasn't heard from him since.